it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Welcome to Undead Live Morning Edition, reporting from the front lines of the zombie apocalypse. We have your back morning, noon, and night, whether you're dead, undead, recently deceased, or fully alive. Today is Thursday, October 15th. I'm Athena Actipus.
And I'm Dave Lundberg-Kenrick, and today we will be streaming live from the Zombie Apocalypse Medicine Meeting and inviting experts to give real-time commentary as well as giving their perspective on everything that's going on these days, from pandemics to just raging mobs to everything in the world. So
yeah. And now for our Apocalypse Today highlights. Harvard medical doctor Steve Schlozman has been obsessively watching zombie movies from the before times, convinced that they hold the secrets that will guide us through the pandemic we're now facing. This notion that zombie movies can help us deal with our current difficulties has been gaining traction among scientists, doctors, and scholars, inspiring program across Channel Z. Steve will be joining us this morning.
And Sarah Hill, a professor and researcher, has somehow, we don't know how exactly, traveled to the future and claims that in the future, humanity has been reduced to headless drones in the service of a queen bee as a result of overuse of hormonal contraception. These results could neither be confirmed nor denied by the National Institute of Time Travel or the Entomological Society of the Americas. Sarah Hill will join us this afternoon in the afternoon edition of Undead Live.
Author and evolutionary biologist David Quammen has pointed out that SARS-CoV, the virus that causes COVID, is actually a success story. From the perspective of the virus, it has been unbelievably evolutionarily successful, albeit at our expense. David Quammen will join us for the evening edition of Undead Live.
And also, today on Undead Live, we'll bring you up-to-date reports on these exciting developments, delivering fresh brains and food for thought throughout the day.
Now, if you're joining our broadcast on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, we encourage you to join our reporting team. Let us know how the zombie apocalypse is going down in your city or neighborhood by posting your comments.
That's right. So really, we will include them, we'll respond to them, and so simply comment on this stream and we'll see your reports in real time and bring them into our broadcast.
And your comments will help us get a much more complete picture of what's happening on the front lines of the zombie apocalypse. So now, what can zombie cinema teach us? The zombie cinema from the before times, what can it teach us about the challenges of today? It's my pleasure to welcome to our program our first featured brain of the day, Harvard medical doctor and author of The Zombie Autopsies, Steve Schlozman, to explain how we can use fictional portrayals of zombies and the zombie apocalypse for dealing with our current apocalyptic moment. Steve, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much for having me during these incredibly trying and important times. I'm happy to be part of this discussion.
It's wonderful to have you here, Steve. We're going to hand the table over to you to guide our discussion.
Sure. Okay. So I want to start with well, I'm going to have a lot of stories in here, and we're going to take about 20, 25 minutes, something like that, to discuss what zombie movies tell us about how we can deal with the current, at least for the purposes of the next 4 days, the current and ongoing zombie pandemic. And if it occurs to you that some of the things I say might actually pertain to other pandemics that might actually persist beyond the next 4 days, all the better. I think that this knowledge can be applied across multiple crises, and I'd like to make that point just in the starting off here. So the first story, I have long thought about zombies. I've long been kind of obsessed with the trope of the zombie. Never did I think we would be facing a world where the zombie trope becomes more real than we'd like it to be. And one of the places where I've decided that to just sort of say that the zombie outbreak is less likely to happen has been at places like Comic-Con or horror conventions or even at scientific conventions, where inevitably somebody raises their hand and says, when will the zombie apocalypse happen? And myself and the other people on the panel, it includes filmmakers, authors, scientists, we've all said it's not going to happen. And then people boo. And we're sort of shocked. We're like, why would you boo? This is terrible. Have you not watched the films? Presumably you're basing your hope on the zombie apocalypse happening on the films that exist about the zombie apocalypse, and those universally end badly. So here we are now in this weird circumstance where, for the purposes of the next 4 days at least, this is real, man. And whether it persists beyond that, I don't know. But this is real. Given that this is real, I think we have the advantage of these films as a kind of pantheon of literature that we can turn to as instructional manuals. But we have to be very careful how we read them. These zombie films, these zombie short stories, these zombie novels, the tales we tell around campfires about zombies, they are not related to public service announcements. They're not akin to telling you what to do. Zombie stories are cautionary tales. I've written a zombie story way before the current crisis, and it was meant as a cautionary tale. So when we glean from these zombie films what we can learn for the current crisis and ongoing crises, we have to make sure that we view these films not as instructions, but as almost anti-instructions of examples of how not to behave. So here's going to be the order of what I'm going to do here. Oh, you had a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Steve. So you mentioned you have a book about the zombie apocalypse. What is that book? Is that a fictional book? Is that a factual book?
When I wrote it, it was fiction. It remains fiction because I remain very skeptical of this movement, as you guys know. It's called The Zombie Autopsies. I just happen to have a copy right here, and I'm actually going to use this image from it. This is not what I think the current zombie crisis looks like, but we are going to use this transection of the brain to point to different neuroanatomic regions, in terms of making sense of what ails the zombie.
Thank you, Steve. So in terms of writing this zombie book, now you see it kind of at the intersection of fact and fiction in a way?
Oh, absolutely. Zombies, as we are learning, map impressively and somewhat frighteningly well onto actual medical processes, or at least onto actual neurobiologic functions, neuroanatomic biologic functions. So we can watch a zombie in the zombie movies, like Night of the Living Dead, the sort of grandfather of all zombie films, of all modern zombie films, made in 1968. And if you think about a brain at all, you cannot look at those zombies and say to yourself, geez, they're healthy. You have to say to yourself, first of all, and most importantly for the purpose of this talk, they're not zombies. They're sick humans infected by some contagion, environmental contaminant, perhaps even hysteria, but there's something not working right with their brains. And once we say that, then we can sort of reverse engineer what got us to that place, what creates the behavior of these humans who are infected with what we're calling the zombie bug, and then from there, glean how to deal with it.
That's really an amazing way of looking at things in terms of the zombie apocalypse. Dave, did you want to jump in?
Well, I was going to say, does that sort of indicate, like, it seems like that process is almost like, oh, we're leading towards trying to cure the zombies, right? Trying to reintegrate them, because normally if we find some infectious agent, which I think in movies it usually ends up somebody's infected, then suddenly our only choice is to run from them. Yeah, here we go. This question from Pam Winfrey: do they deserve our sympathy? I think
absolutely, because they're not they're us. Like this othering that happens in zombie films. That's the first cautionary tale of zombie movies. We decide that there's humans and there are zombies. We forget that the zombies were once human and are still human. We would never say that somebody with pneumonia is an pneumonia. We would say they suffer from pneumonia, and we would try to cure the pneumonia. So when I talk sometimes to medical students in the fictional days and say, hey, what would you do about a zombie? And they say, hit him in the head. I say, no, You're medical students. You want to make them better. They're humans who are sick. How will you help to make them better? And they'll say, well, what's making them sick? And that's what leads us down the path that you just mentioned.
Interesting. So when someone has a flu, I shouldn't hit them in the head.
No, absolutely not. I can't think of a single illness for which hitting somebody in the head has curative properties.
Okay. Even amnesia, because I know in old cartoons it seemed to work really well.
I think the key word there is cartoons. So
Okay.
in old cartoons, when the anvil falls on Wile E. Coyote, he almost never looks better. And if his memory comes back, it's not a pleasant moment for him. So I think we're aiming to make the people who are suffering not suffer. That's the oath we take as physicians, and it's kind of the oath we take as humans.
No. What about when we're looking at these movies and things? There's this idea that they, at the same time, sort of threaten us, and I think you see this in movies like the Dawn of the Dead remake, right, where they are thinking of these people as humans until they get to this point where we have to weigh our own survival against their survival, right?
Yep.
So
Yeah. So that gets to actually, I made a very scientifically derived and written down quick list that I'm going to hold up to the screen here. If you remember nothing from this talk, you should remember these 4 steps. And the first one is resist chaos. After that, we have trust science, avoid bias, and acknowledge your advantage. So in the remake of Dawn of the Dead, definitely in the original Dawn of the Dead, chaos starts to generate fear, and then fear ricochets back to chaos, and it bounces back and forth, and that leads you to make some kind of rigid algorithms with which to approach the problem. You get stuck within a certain way of thinking that the chaos itself becomes the threat, and the chaos in this case is literally represented by the hordes that seem to be attacking you. You have more time than you think you do. You don't have to do the things that you think you have to do to stop this horde from attacking you. If we're talking about the zombies in the original Dawn of the Dead or Night of the Living Dead, all you have to do is put a fence around them. And by that, I mean it metaphorically. All you have to do is get them into the hospital. They can barely walk. You can eat a sandwich while you're trying to run away. So why in the world would you shoot them in the head? You don't have to. Why don't you just secure them and then try to figure out what's wrong? It's the chaos and the fear that leads to that explosion of emotion, that loss of the frontal lobe function that the zombies themselves suffer, but we ought to know better because we still have a frontal lobe.
Sure. So then what's the step 2?
Step 2. And just because it's written in Sharpie ink doesn't mean it's any less authoritative. Trust the science, okay? Trust the data that we have. One of the things that happens in chaotic states is you start to not trust the processes that we've long established to determine what's right and what's not right, or what's real and what's not real. It may be that if you're infected with the zombie bug, maybe you got bit and you don't even remember it. Maybe the zombie bug is airborne and it's as it was in my book, and you've been infected in that way. You don't know when you're going to change. You don't even know if you've been infected in some cases, and there might be other pandemics where it's the same, where you don't quite know if you're infected or not. It would be reasonable to protect yourself and others by taking precautions. You might, for example, if you have an airborne infection, wear one of these. It's a very straightforward move. It's not a political move. It's a scientific move. If we're in the zombie pandemic, it might make sense to go out with a muzzle on because you don't know at what time you're going to change. And if you happen to change when you're crossing the street on the way in to get a Starbucks cup of coffee in a properly secured location, if you happen to change at that point, you would never forgive yourself if you ate somebody. So you need to wear the muzzles, just like in other pandemics, you have to wear a mask. That's an example of the science reigning supreme.
Interesting.
And what's number 3?
Number 3, avoid bias. That should be plural, avoid biases. One of the things that happens when we are in a chaotic situation where unprecedented events are unfolding, and we know this based on stories of hysteria going all the way back to the times of Galen and before Galen, one of the physicians from antiquity, is that we return to previous pre-existing notions about things that we've actually at some point dismissed as not being true. The sort of evil stepbrother of bias is the idea that it's the notion of confirmation bias. That's the best way of putting it. It's the idea that you selectively choose evidence in support of something you've already decided to do, and you selectively, even worse, discard evidence that argues against you doing something that you want to do. So these biases are very likely to kind of bubble to the surface. You're going to look at somebody who's been infected by this zombie contagion, and you're going to have a bias against them, in part because we have this long pantheon of zombie movies, and we're going to say to ourselves, oh my goodness, that's a zombie. I better do what I've been taught to do based on the old algorithms to avoid chaos, which means I hit them over the head with a cricket bat, as in Shaun of the Dead. There's one of our movie references. And yet, that would be a biased moment because, as I said, you don't need to hit them over the head with a cricket bat. All you need to do is put a fence around them. And then it's done.
So, Steve, some of these lessons really from zombie movies, like you said, are not so much about what to do in the zombie apocalypse, but really what not to do. And it sounds like this issue of avoiding bias is one of those really, really important lessons.
Oh, absolutely. How many zombie films have you seen where you are literally yelling at the screen? I mean, that's part of the fun of a zombie movie. Before we were dealing with this issue that we're dealing with now for this meeting, before, when it was just safely on our movie screens or on our TV screens, we would yell, why are you doing that? And forget the biases for a second that you might hold against people who are infected by the contagion itself. There's the biases that pre-existed before the contagion emerged. You see people in shows like The Walking Dead, for example, who absolutely refuse to let go of their racist principles when it would behoove all of them to work together. So you see people not willing to sit next to other folks who aren't infected because they are people in the before times they found themselves prejudiced against. That's another bias that you have to especially avoid during this time of emerging chaos.
And so what is our fourth rule of thumb now, Steve?
This is in some ways the most important. Acknowledge your advantage. So if we are going to win this battle against the zombie pandemic, we have to think to ourselves, what is on our side that the people we're trying to help who are infected don't have? How can we bring what gives us an advantage over them, which in this case is literally the things that exist in our frontal lobe? Because as I said, the zombie humans, the humans who've been infected, they don't have much of a frontal lobe. They're functioning purely with the amygdala, purely with the fight or flight response. We can use that frontal lobe to overcome this fight or flight response, to actually sit on it. In fact, that's the role of the frontal lobe. When the amygdala kicks a message north and says, "Here, we can use my phrenology model, which I have right here. So here's your frontal lobe up top, your amygdala you can imagine down here. If the amygdala starts screaming, the frontal lobe has to make a decision. Do I pay attention to this or do I leave it behind? We need to use the advantage of the frontal lobe to solve problems. Remember, zombies can't even open windows or doors. They don't get to a window that's too high and think, I must now go get a ladder. They're not capable of doing that. But we are. We can use metaphoric ladders, and that has to do with experiments, with animal models, with science, with vaccines, with medicines. We can reverse engineer this because we have a functional frontal lobe and therefore treat it.
Steve, we have a question, kind of a tough one about science here. So Chris Patton says, when the public gets a view of the scientific process, and how it has this sort of process of revision within it, that to some people it looks like confusion. So how do we convey proof that science is working and that people should really be trusting science?
It's a really, really good question. And as it might occur to many of the viewers out there, it's a question that's relevant not just to this current zombie pandemic, but to other pandemics that might be happening. I think you need to start by defining science, and you have to do it more actively than we've done so far. You have to say that science is, by definition, a process of revising your hypotheses. In fact, that's the nature of a hypothesis. You test it, and if it turns out not to be correct, you don't shamefully say, well, I was wrong. You say, we have discovered through the careful work of a scientific process that what we thought previously was the case turns out not to be the case. And that's why we moved on to the next step. What seems like confusion is actually progress, because the quandaries that come from these scientific experiments come precisely from trying to answer questions that have confused us.
Now, I think one thing I wonder when I hear this is all these decisions sort of have to be made quickly, right? And I think both at the sort of personal scale and the societal scale, we're talking about science sort of takes time, right? But when in these zombie movies, it spreads really quickly. And so how can we sort of trust a slow process in these,
Right. No, it's a really neat question. What we will have to do is develop algorithmic approaches that are based in science and that we're willing to actually be nimble with as well. If you think about what happens in the trauma room in a tertiary care center at a hospital, a patient comes in having been badly injured. They don't have time to use all of their slow process thinking to assess how much damage is to the patient. They have algorithms that they follow that go in the order of what's most likely to hurt the patient to what's least likely to hurt the patient. We'll have to develop similar algorithms to, say, separate out somebody who's infected with the zombie bug from somebody who is simply intoxicated to somebody who's infected with a different agent. And we'll have to be nimble with those things as the science moves us forward, because we will base those algorithms on certain hypotheses that we will also in real time be testing. So there has to be adequate conveyance of information that comes from the top down in a public service capacity, the exact opposite of what happens in zombie films.
So essentially we would need also on the individual level, people would need a sort of checklist of, if I see, so here I've got my muzzle here. You see someone with a muzzle, what are your sort of steps to responding, and how do you decide? Because you have to quickly decide, is this person going to attack me, right?
Right.
Because the stakes are high, even if the risks are low. So
so you have an algorithm. You have an algorithm for determining, is my congestion related to my contraction of the zombie bug, or is it related to allergies? Because those are really different stakes when you think about it. You have to have some way of making people think that they are, or know actually, that they have some control over what would otherwise be, again, this chaotic circumstance. Fear is the mind killer, as they said in Dune, a still fictional book.
Thank you, Steve. I have to ask. So, you as a doctor at Harvard, and somebody who studies zombies and the zombie apocalypse, how does that intersect with your identity as a medical doctor?
Well, until this meeting, it intersected actually in a wonderful way. It lent itself to education. You can get people's attention very quickly if you show them an image like that one, right? Like they're going to perk up and look. So if I show that to them and say, look, that's not a real zombie, because zombies don't exist. This is in the before times, of course. But I can say we can look at the functions of a zombie and from that glean what we know about functional neuroanatomy. In other words, I can say their frontal lobe solves problems. The ventromedial hypothalamus has to do with satiety, the sense that you've eaten enough. The amygdala has to do with a fight or flight. The cerebellum has to do with balance. The basal ganglia has to do with fluid motions. It's this kind of hook to get people in the room so that you can teach people, and I've done this as young as 8 years old and as old as however old people want to be, if they're interested in learning this material. It actually puts me firmly in the educator's seat, which is a place I've always liked to be.
And has that changed your relationship with studying the zombie apocalypse and being a medical doctor? I mean, I understand, for example, that Harvard's official position is that the zombie apocalypse is not happening, that there are no zombies. Is that correct?
Well, I would have said that until I got a strange underground text this morning that told me that I'm not really allowed to comment on Harvard's official position. So I can say that the unofficial announcements I'm getting is that they hold great doubt as to the existence of the zombie pandemic. But I am not now, nor have I ever been, a speaker for Harvard.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for clarifying that, Stephen.
Sure.
We have some questions here about sort of the narratives behind zombie films. Maybe we could look here at Liz's question. She's asking here about like the link between narrative-based healthcare as well, and sort of this idea of listening to patients and or yourself. And she actually notes here she wants to be inclusive here, not just human, but also potential zombie based. So what are your thoughts on that, Stephen?
First of all, I very much appreciate both the desire to be inclusive and also the question itself. Absolutely, narrative is everything. Since we've been able to talk, we've been telling stories. We're much better at conveying both information factually and also generating empathy through narrative than we are through bullet points on a PowerPoint slide. So something's happened in our educational efforts where we started to teach things in bullet points. Nevertheless, we know that people learn better when we tell stories. In terms of patient care, that is everything. And that takes time. So the more we're rushing patients through our offices, the more that revolving door of the hospital spins, the faster it spins with patients going in and out, the less time we give them to tell the story, to display the nuances of their stories. And it's through those nuances that we can affect cures. Without that narrative, we're reduced to kind of bullet points. And with those bullet points alone, I think actually we miss the in-between spaces, which make the practice of medicine fun and also the likelihood of making people better.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to pull in a question here from Ilana, now that we're talking about zombie narratives. She's asking about whether, there are good examples of zombie movies that don't end horribly. Are there narratives that really look at zombies as more human and maybe also end well?
Yeah, so it depends, because this concept of the zombie, as we're learning at this meeting, has been broadened, so we can sort of wrap in a lot of different narratives under this one roof. There are movies like The Girl with All the Gifts, which some people have called a zombie movie, some people have not. It has to do with a fungal infection leading to zombie-like behavior. And the end of that, there's a kind of resolution, an ability to live with the folks who are infected versus the folks who aren't. There is the end of Shaun of the Dead, where he's playing video games with his buddy who is still infected and still has a zombie. His buddy's not that good at it, but he sits there next to him with a leash on. There's the movie Fido, which basically thinks of zombies. It's a great Canadian film if you haven't seen it, as a kind of pet, which obviously I would never want like patients to be pets. But in this particular movie, the zombie, the infected person, can still be helpful to the little boy who's being bullied. The little boy will be tied to a tree by bad kids, and the zombie Fido, that's what he names him, comes home, and the mother says, "What's going on, Fido?" And Fido goes, "Rah." He says, "What's that? Billy's up in the woods." And he says, "Rah, rah, 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 rah." He said, "I better go get him." It may seem a little bit like shows like Lassie you've seen in the past. I'm sure that's purely coincidental, but those are examples of sort of retelling the zombie story in a more positive light.
Yeah, I love that movie Fido, because it really, paints this picture of, zombie as a member of the family. Somewhere between a household helper and a dog and a husband, right? It's like somewhere in that in-between space. So
yeah, it creates a homeostasis, right? Like rather than there always being a battle, we found a way to sort of live with this. And we do that with all sorts of, we don't make people helpers, but we do that with all sorts of illnesses. We manage them. We don't always cure them.
Yeah, it looks like we have a lot of fans of Fido here in the audience. Liz loves it, and so does E. Lee. So yeah, it's a great.
I'm
movie.
so glad they're mentioning it, because I think it's a very underwatched film. I wish people watched it more.
Well, this is great. So I think this is really useful information. So
yeah, Steve, is there anything that you want to make sure that our viewers take away in terms of, knowledge and understanding from zombie films, either as, direct knowledge or sort of, cautionary warnings for us as to what we should not do?
Yeah. So most importantly, retain your humanity, which I know sounds kumbaya-ish, but these are desperate times. And during desperate times, we tend to forget our humanity. We tend to forget the importance that we play for one another. We are social creatures. If we decide that we're going to deal with the current crisis by walling ourselves off from the rest of the world, it's not going to be a very pleasant existence. And in fact, we're more likely to make mistakes. So we should take advantage of each other's companies in the best of ways, be with each other, tell stories. And if you find yourself watching a zombie film, don't shy away from it. Just don't see it as an instructional manual. See it as a manual of how not to behave.
Thank you, Steve. I have to say, I had absolutely no idea how much we could learn from zombie cinema. Thank you so much for sharing your brains with us this morning.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Can I mention one more thing?
Yeah, you bet.
So I got this buddy, Larry Fessenden. He and I, he's a filmmaker. We get together every year and talk all the time, but especially in October, about scary movies. Typically, we'll talk about zombie films. Larry's even been involved in the making of some zombie films. We often, because I guess we're kind of arrogant, we like to videotape ourselves. So I sent you a videotape. You don't have to play it. It might strike you as completely silly, but if you feel like playing it, we'll continue to send them to Channel Z. We're just so delighted you guys are on the air, and we just figured it couldn't hurt to ask.
I think we should take a look at it. So,
well, I mean, maybe, but we kind of have a schedule. So,
all right, let's do it.
It's up to you guys.
Quickly reflect on some classics, just since we're here and it's October.
So I will be revisiting zombie films for sure.
Of course, there's the best zombie film of all is the first.
The Night of the Living Dead first, that one?
Of the Living Dead, yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there are purists, right, who will say that there were zombies before that, and there's White Zombie and, Bela Lugosi. But in terms of the zombies that we think of, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, the slow, shambling, dumb as a doorknob, couldn't catch you if they really wanted to, if their undead life depended on it, of Night of the Living Dead, those are the scariest. That's the best one ever, and I will stake literally my life on it.
So were you among those who was completely outraged by the Fast Zombie? I think, again, a movie that doesn't call them zombies, but 28 Days Later was when another director of renown started speeding up the zombies.
So 20 Days Later, amazing film. I'm not calling them zombies because they are fast and they engage in pack behavior and they don't want to eat you. They just want to kill you. So by those three criteria, they don't meet my kind of zombie list, which is not to say it's not a great film. And there's the Resident Evil zombies. They're fast. There's the Rage, or the ones in Quarantine, the ones in the Wreck movies.
Oh, and Fast Zombies, Last Train to Busan. Amazing.
They're all fast. None of them seem that interested in eating you. They seem more interested in killing you.
I want to say the opening scene of 28 Weeks Later, and forgive me, I can't think of the director, but is fantastic. It's really terrifying. And it's loaded because the guy abandons his wife. So there's the shame of cowardice that is actually the plot of the movie and how that catches up to him.
Yeah, no, it's one of my favorite horror movie sequels.
Another guilty pleasure is World War Z. Those are very fast zombies.
What's the idea of being overwhelmed there? I mean, when they're going up over the wall in Jerusalem, it's terrifying. And they look like ants. I mean, they look like bugs. The extent to which they spread. Totally not in keeping with medical logic here, as if zombies were. But the counting, Brad Pitt going 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000.
But the zombie there outside the window is really quite memorable. The teeth.
The lizard one. Yeah.
Well, the funny thing, if you watch that movie, is there's no gore, and you realize it's a Hollywood film, and it's something you come to sort of expect in a zombie movie. I don't necessarily need it, but the absence of it is sort of oddly startling.
Yeah.
Very sanitized film, even though there's quite a lot of mayhem.
Right. It's this weird reverse that happens where we are put off by the absence of gore.
Did you read about these? I don't know. I feel like they're I can't remember. It was in the Midwest or something. There was apparently some people saying there were zombies outside or something.
I did see that. No, that was crazy. I don't know. I grew up in the Midwest, and so I can picture.
Well, were they?
What'd you say?
Were there zombies in the Midwest?
There were not when I was growing up. At least none that acknowledged themselves as such. But I can picture, it helped me because I can picture like the cabin they described, but it was in the countryside. It wasn't in the city or even in the suburbs. And they were describing these like kind of, one guy called them stumblers. Like they weren't walking. My first thought was they're probably drunk. Like just, I mean, that's a better explanation for somebody. There's a lot of good beer, right? So it's a better explanation than zombies. But he said they were covered in blood and they just kept walking, and he tried to help them, and they just walked kind of past the house and turned to look at him and growled. That was the story. Which I'm having, so like
first we have slow zombies, then we have fast zombies, now we have growling zombies.
Yeah, and this is why I'm not buying it exactly. I'm not buying it for a bunch of reasons. One is because I don't think zombies are real, and two is he's got to get his story straight. He hasn't decided what kind of zombie he wants it to be. The guy reported it to the
maybe
local
he
news.
was drunk.
Yeah. I'm not buying it. I did see the story though.
It's weird. I mean, it feels like just an October, let's drop some zombie stories in October.
So I am not going to call this zombie from the Midwest or anywhere else a zombie until I have more definitive proof. And I expect that proof mainly to be on a movie screen.
Well, you're the professor. I, as a lover of narratives, believe that there are now zombies in the Midwest, and they're no doubt going to spread east.
Right.
Wow. Okay.
So
That's from like a week and a half ago, roughly, when we were talking about this. We did see that news story. I don't know what to make of it.
So Larry looks really familiar.
You have seen him in multiple befores. You just have to pay attention because he usually leaves the movies that he's in after about a minute and a half. He's made a bunch of movies, but he's appeared in nearly 100 movies, and he usually dies in the first minute to 2 minutes. It's almost like an Easter egg for horror fans. I've always wanted to be a movie star, and I always joke that if I were, I will make it past the first 2 minutes.
I mean, I think it's really interesting. So the zombie in the Midwest, that's a scary thing.
If it's real, it's not real.
You don't think so?
Not
I
buying
don't know.
No.
I don't know. So
No, not yet.
I mean, Liz says, look, she says, was this filmed before we knew zombies were out there? Downtown Phoenix totally overrun today. So
we did shoot it before then. Yeah, that was when we didn't shoot it. We just pushed the little record button on Zoom as you have to do nowadays. But yeah, I'm sorry about downtown Phoenix. It hasn't quite hit the suburbs where I am now. But who knows how it'll unfold.
Wow. Well, I mean, Steve, Larry, we really appreciate you guys sending in this video. We kind of have a whole process though for correspondence, and we're going to need to focus on like the news that's happening. I mean, I it's great, but Dave and I are going to have to talk about it.
Okay. So I totally understand. I figured I'd never forgive myself if I didn't try.
Yeah. Well, we really, really appreciate it. So
I thought it was cool. So,
Thank you, Dave.
sure.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us here on Undead Live. We hope we'll get your comments and ideas as we move forward with the rest of the show today. And right now, we're going to continue on. If you have ever been bitten by a zombie, vampire, or werewolf, you know just how terrifying it is to face losing control as your brain and body are taken over by something that is not you. Just how scared should you be of real-life monsters and predators? And how can you protect yourself by getting inside the predatory mindset of those who will stop at nothing to zombify you? We're joined here today by forensic psychiatrists from Broadcast Thought. Eric, welcome.
Oh, we're going to unmute you here.
All right.
Go ahead. Say that one more time.
Good morning. I'm Eric. Hi, everybody.
Hello. Thanks for joining us.
I hope you can hear me okay. I am from New Jersey, so if I'm talking too loud, please let me know. All right. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm gonna introduce my colleague, Vasilis.
Oh, okay. You add him, Athena.
There we go. Right. You do it now.
All right. Vasilius, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, how's it going?
Great. I want to introduce my our third colleague, Dr. Praveen Kambam.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. So we're three forensic psychiatrists that make up Broadcast Thought, media and mental health consultancy and advocacy group. So really happy to be back here at ZAM 2020. We hope everyone out there is getting a great conference so far.
Yeah, and we are going to
Thanks so
talk
much
about
for being
zombies.
here with us. Well,
Go ahead.
excellent. All right. We're going to give you guys the floor so that you can share all of your intriguing insights about real life zombies and how we can help ourselves be ready for the real life predators that we may be encountering.
All right. Thanks, Athena. I know you did mention the terrifying nature of being bitten by a zombie. So we are going to talk about that. And one of the most terrifying aspects of being bitten by a zombie, or a werewolf or a vampire for that matter, is losing control of your mind, your body, and your soul. But could this actually happen outside the pages of a comic book or outside the confines of your TV screen? Let's find out.
So in Free Will Hunted, part 1 of this 2-part talk, we're going to examine the fictional and real-life examples of monsters and predators taking over others' will and their subsequent creation of zombies. We'll analyze this loss of will by looking at a series of real-life and fictional cases. So without further ado...
All right, let's take a look at case number 1, the first real-life zombie. You might have heard of Clervius Narcisse, a Haitian man who goes to a hospital in 1962 with fever, fatigue, and the coughing up of blood. He's declared dead a few days later after his symptoms worsened. Naturally, he's then buried.
18 years later, almost supernaturally, he rises from the grave, only to seek out and approach his sister in a marketplace. Clervius convinces her that he is, in fact, not dead, but very much alive. He claims he had been conscious, but paralyzed during his burial, and then forced and enslaved to work on a plantation.
Subsequent reports indicate that Clervius had been drugged with a concoction of toxins consisting of tetrodotoxin, otherwise known as pufferfish toxin, and bufotoxin, or toad toxin, that together paralyzed him, allowing him to be buried against his will. In fact, he later recalls having sheets pulled over his eyes and being lowered into the ground.
So while still under the influence of these toxins, he was dug up by a Bakur, or a voodoo witch. Now let me tell you, this was no good witch. The Bakur repeatedly drugged Clervius with Datura stramonium, which is also known as Jimson weed or the devil's snare. So the effect? A persistent hallucinogenic state and memory loss, leaving Clervius enslaved as a zombie worker on a sugar plantation.
Years later, the Bakur died, and Clervius was no longer served up his hallucinogenic cocktail. His mental faculties returned, and then he returned to his family 16 years later. I guess that road back home must have been a long one.
While Clervius was pharmacologically zombified, let's take a look at a more surgical case of zombification.
So case number 2, the case of Konarek. This is the case of 14-year-old Konarek Synthesumphone, who was found walking naked in the streets near his neighbor houses in Milwaukee back in 1991.
The haunting details of this case are that earlier in the day, Jeffrey Dahmer lures Konarek to his apartment and drugs him. Dahmer later stated he wanted Konarek under his complete control, so he decided to create his own zombie.
Dahmer was no stranger to this technique. When he was later caught and interviewed, he admitted to drilling tiny holes in his victims' skulls through which he injected hydrochloric acid to zombify them.
On the night Dahmer lures Konarek to his apartment, Dahmer leaves to get more alcohol. Konarek remarkably wakes up somewhat and escapes, walking around the neighborhood naked, only to encounter 3 women who swiftly call 911. Shortly after, Dahmer spots Konarek with the women. Dahmer approaches them and claims that the boy was his friend.
When the police arrive on the scene, Dahmer explains that the boy was in fact an adult, his boyfriend, and is simply drunk. Unsuspecting police escort Konarek and Dahmer back to Dahmer's apartment before leaving the scene. And as you know, old habits die hard, so Dahmer injects Konarek's skull a second time with hydrochloric acid, this time killing the 14-year-old boy.
The police thought Konerik was just a freak in Dahmer's sheets, but he was really a zombie in the streets.
Now, while these first two cases involve crude medical and surgical zombification, let's consider other means. Can humans be controlled through less invasive means? Perhaps we have a hand in our own zombification.
Which brings us to case number 3, cult control. Given all that's happening in the world right now, it's not that far of a stretch to imagine an apocalypse, but picture a zombie apocalypse. Anxiety's high. Feelings of insecurity run rampant. So in walks a man wearing a black leather jacket, wielding a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. He promises you food, shelter, and protection. All you have to do is just swear allegiance to him and his group.
Oh yeah, but just be sure to obey him, or you might have your face ironed, or you might get thrown in a cell and fed dog food for weeks.
So what would make someone join such a horrifying group, or perhaps better stated, a cult?
So according to the Interministerial Mission for Vigilance and Combating Sectarian Aberration in France, quite a mouthful, a cult is, quote, an organized group or a solitary person whose purpose is to dominate cult members by using psychological manipulation and pressure strategies, end quote. Sounds a little bit like Negan, no?
So back to our question, why did people join cults and how do they lose their free will to the group and to the leader?
So as you can see in this slide, research has shown some relevant commonalities among cult members that influence their decision to join. Anxiety disorders, depressive symptoms, being on a spiritual or religious quest, and a need for personal development or life satisfaction. In a zombie apocalypse, such self-actualization is clearly not the priority. The main goal is, of course, to survive. Negan seemingly offers that chance, actually naming his group the Saviors, and makes it hard for members to leave.
In the real world, people get stuck in cults by becoming zombified in their own way. They almost blindly follow the cult leader, mindlessly so. The members have difficulty questioning the group's creeds. They become dependent on the leader and the group itself. And the cult members no longer make individual decisions, essentially losing control of their own minds.
And they even lose their individual identity. They each claim, I am Negan. And Negan's saviors, they felt they were getting something from the group. And truth be told, they probably were. They were getting food and clothing, shelter, protection, community. But they fell under the spell of a charismatic and terrifying leader. And their fear of isolation and fear of him, they left them tied to the group and to the cult.
While Negan's saviors may have been actively willing to zombify themselves as part of the group in order to survive, unsuspecting humans might be zombified through more passive and insidious means. Are we becoming zombies more and more each day, even possibly as we speak? And we mean that literally. Those of you that are on your phones right now know what I'm talking about. How many of us blindly click the link, like the post, swipe left, or even doom scroll? Are we under a sort of spell ourselves?
Let's listen to Sean Parker, co-founder of Facebook. Not sure if you could hear that, but what Sean Parker was talking about was how his idea in making Facebook was to get you to get a little dopamine hit every time you got a like for your post. And so you'd post again and again and again to the point where they would control you, essentially. And he said this was a manipulation of psychology. That's exactly what they started out doing, realized what they were doing, and went ahead and did it.
So maybe we're mindlessly falling prey to the trappings of technology. What would happen if we unplugged the tech? Could we resurrect our free will? Thank you, and we'll take some questions before part 2 of our talk.
Thank you, Broadcast Thought. We have some questions here. The first one is, I think people are interested in hearing a little bit more about what Facebook is exactly doing, what their algorithms are doing. Could you maybe explain a little bit more what that clip was saying?
Yeah, sure. So
Go ahead, Zane.
the idea was, I don't know if anyone has seen the documentary on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, but they lay it out there pretty clearly. It's essentially a mechanism to get you addicted to clicking and scrolling, and he talks about giving you a dopamine hit. What he's basically saying is the system in our brain that makes us feel rewarded for things, which is also involved in addiction, gets some stimulation there. And so their thought was, how do we hack the human brain? How do we get it so we can take their attention? And if they put their phone down, how do we get them to pick their phone back up and like things and scroll? So essentially, we have insidiously become zombified by these devices.
And do you guys think that there is a true parallel between these sort of more extreme physical types of zombification and the electronic or algorithmic zombification that's going on with technology?
Well, I think what Steve was talking about earlier, if you go back to neuroanatomy, I think that is the common thread here. The frontal lobe and making decisions and choosing to do things, in a way, it's being controlled, or you lose control when you're zombified, physically not able to walk any longer, make choices, or you can walk, but you can't really communicate and make your own choices and decisions. You're just instinctually driven. That's what a lot of the technology is doing too. It's almost trying to create an instinct to click. The idea of what color was most likely to get you to buy something on some of these websites. That's been researched. There's a whole field in terms of deciding what will make people likely to do what. And so I do think that that's the common link, is physically, you're not able to express yourself. Physically here, you're just instinctually driven to click, to buy, to post, to scroll.
So we have a question here from Pam Winfrey that says, does something physical happen to cult members' brains? Which I think also ties into this question of, does something physical happen when we're being zombified by technology?
So as psychiatrists, for us, everything becomes physical on some level. So us talking to you right now, we're actually altering your brain chemistry. So it's kind of a hard thing to separate. So yes, definitely something is happening physically in your brain on that neuroscience or neuroanatomical level, but that could be influenced by what's happening in your environment.
So one other question she had that sort of goes hand in hand with it is, are zombies then legally responsible for their behavior? Anybody?
Well, I guess the answer is that depends. This is a topic that we addressed in our last talk at the inaugural Zombie Apocalypse Medicine Conference. And, there are some analogies between fiction and real life. Are there circumstances that cause somebody not to be legally responsible for their behavior? In the real world, oftentimes that falls under the umbrella of affirmative defenses, mainly not guilty by reason of insanity. But there are some other examples of that don't have to do necessarily with insanity, but have to do with your inability to basically control your body. And so when people are sleepwalkers, for example, might fall under that category of people that aren't in control of their behavior per se. It's interesting to kind of, again, draw that analogy to the world of zombies and think, is it something that is impacting their ability to, formulate a mens rea, or is it something that has to do with their inability to control their physical actions?
What is a mens rea?
It's the ability to basically the guilty mind, the mindset that you have when you are engaging in a criminal act.
Gotcha. So
And so I guess that's arguable depending on the kind of zombie that you're talking about.
So we have one other question that I think fits with this, which is Indru Gasink says, I'm curious to hear an elaboration or example of processes of thought control. So,
well, thought control could be many different things. So we gave some examples of how thought control could happen by being drugged, by being surgically altered in your brain. We gave some examples of how we may be controlled by joining a cult and a slow psychological process that happens over time. That can happen also with victims of abuse at times, the whole grooming idea. So there's lots of different ways that we can have thought control happening. The last example we gave was the technology. So think about that, especially with the way politics are now, we're told a certain narrative or we're fed an algorithm that shows us things that reinforce what we already believe. Steve talked about confirmation bias. So that happens here too. So all of those things are different examples of thought control. So I think it can happen in many, many different ways.
So
There's
somebody
also-
says, go ahead.
Dave, I was just going to add that also even in hypnosis, I don't know if you've ever seen performances by hypnotists, but they can hypnotize people and get them to think and do all sorts of things, act out. A 40-year-old might act out what their 50th birthday party was like. You can have thought control in that way too.
So here's a question from Denise Mercado. Can we be zombified to do positive things? Cults have a negative connotation, but religions act very similarly and often zombify people to do good things. So what do you think?
I think the question is the free will, right? And so there's always a tension between free will and how you're influenced. And so I think as long as we're respecting somebody's humanity and their dignity and their autonomy, then those are good things. But when you lose those things and these are used or exploited for bad things like what we mentioned, then it's a negative issue here.
On a kind of related note, Ilana is asking, what are the current cults that are posing a big threat to humanity? Is it, small isolated groups or much larger groups? And, why is it that we should be worried about these kinds of mind control?
Well, without commenting on who's in a cult or not, I would say that the thing is probably the most salient right now, and especially in the eyes of us as forensic psychiatrists, are extremist groups that may be prone to violence. And I would say that's probably the largest thing we're looking at. But there are other cults out there that are the more traditional things that we think of.
Yeah, I think sort of what you guys were saying with technology, right, is sometimes cults they aren't necessarily always defined where they say, hey, welcome to our cult, right? There's a lot of things that can control our behavior without specifically fitting that traditional idea of a cult.
Yeah, and my understanding of cults, just from some reading that I've done, is very often people end up in them because they are hoping to have a positive impact on the world, and they think that that's actually part of that's the main goal of that organization. So they can be lured in sometimes with sort of lies and false goals that don't really map on to what the true functioning is of the cult. Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's where the psychological manipulation can come in. Is a cult leader or figure might recognize someone's desire to do good work and really manipulate that, take advantage of it, even exploit it. And so I do think that can happen.
Yeah, the research that Dr. Pozios presented, it's about 2/3 of individuals joined because they were seeking some sort of personal development.
Yeah, well, that seems like it's maybe a good tie-in to talking now about ill will, which is part 2 of Broadcast Thoughts presentation for us today. Eric, do you want to continue with ill will?
Sure. Praveen, why don't you go ahead and start this section?
Sure. In part 1 of the talk, we talked about free will hunted. We looked at a series of real life and fictional cases of zombies, basically beings who had their free will taken over. So in part 2, Ill Will Hunted, we're going to take a look at the predators themselves.
Yeah, and let's start anywhere from zombie cannibalism and vampire seduction to werewolf stalking and real life serial killers. I want to examine with my colleagues the killing methods and the mindset of some really notorious characters who overtake others' free will.
Zombies may be eating brains, but they're not using their whole brains to seek out their victims. It's more of an instinctual drive, similar to brainstem activities like breathing. Indeed, this brand of cannibalism is the hallmark of zombies.
In the real world, cannibalism happens for lots of different reasons. Sometimes it's out of necessity. You might recognize the Donner Party on the left, or the Uruguayan rugby team that crashed in the Andes is depicted in the movie Alive. Sometimes the cannibalism is part of a ritual in wartime, where some cultures consume the flesh of an enemy after killing them, or for supernatural beliefs, as seen in certain tribes in Papua New Guinea, who believe they need to ingest others who've been taken over by evil spirits. And sometimes it's just tied to serial murder.
So cannibalistic killer Jeffrey Dahmer, whom we've already mentioned, he had an interest in creating zombies, but Dahmer was not purely instinctual. He actually had an ill will and even contrasted himself against these zombie victims that he had. So in that way, he was more like a vampire, having this predatory planned method. Dahmer was also like vampires in that he had a belief that if he ate the flesh of his victims, he would incorporate those victims.
In some vampire lore, vampires gain their victims' knowledge and memories when they consume their blood, essentially absorbing some of their life essence. One example is in the Underworld series. The vampire elder Victor is awoken early by Celine, whose blood transmits her memories to him. We see another example in the BBC series Dracula, in which Dracula accesses his victims' memories by drinking their blood, and thereby absorbs their knowledge, abilities, and attributes.
Another predatory tactic of vampires is to entice and tempt their prey through emotional manipulation. They promise eternal life, or the end of human sadness, suffering, and pain. In Interview with a Vampire, for instance, Lestat offers Luis relief from the overwhelming grief he feels after losing his wife and daughter. In real life, serial killers often exploit human desire and emotion as well.
So let's go with Ted Bundy. Actually, let's not go with Ted Bundy, but let's examine his approach. Bundy would often fake an injury and use props like crutches to make him look more in need of help. And then he'd approach an unsuspecting Good Samaritan, often a young, quite attractive female Good Samaritan. And he would exploit that desire, that human desire to help someone. He also leveraged his looks and his charisma to entice his victim.
Perhaps more than many depictions of Dracula, BBC's Dracula reminds us of how central sex is to Dracula's MO.
Yeah, like George Michael, he wants your sex. Often, real-life serial murderers have a psychosexual motivation to their killing.
Of note, this more calculated predation is in contrast to werewolf killing, which is typically more feral and bestial. In real life, the killing style of Jack the Ripper and the Night Stalker parallel the werewolf's wild style of killing. These real-life murderers leave bodies strewn about with little to no organization to their killing. The crime scenes reveal much more of a blitz style of killing.
But vampires can also have more feral drive as well. You know, think about vampires' bloodlust reverts them back to more bestial and instinctual creatures when they haven't fed for a while.
So is it that vampires reflect several different aspects of real-world murder?
Certainly, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, when Dracula pursues Mina Harker, he appears to be predatory at times and motivated by love at other times, bringing to mind aspects of both real-life predatory stalkers as well as intimacy-seeking stalkers.
Well, something we don't see with werewolves or zombies, but we do see with vampires are familiars, enablers that present themselves as devotees to a particular vampire group of vampires, and essentially allow them to live their vampire life. Although not called this in Bram Stoker's Dracula, Renfield helped Dracula do his bidding for the promise of eternity.
And these real-life Renfields do exist. They're dedicated to their masters. They're keeping them alive, feeding their appetites, and keeping them out of trouble. We can take a look at a few potentially real-life Renfields.
So from both of our presentations today, you can see the brain-eating binges of zombies, the feral desires of werewolves, and the bloodlust of vampires are not simply reserved for stories of the apocalypse, the full moon, and the cover of darkness.
And more broadly, aspects of a zombie apocalypse, and for that matter, behaviors of other fictional monsters, not only represent, but can also reflect the darker side of humanity.
We hope you'll have a chance to explore these concepts throughout this conference and feed your brains so they'll be nice and juicy for the monsters and zombies lurking around the corner. Thank you, and we'd be happy to take some more questions if there's time.
Thank you. That was amazing. We definitely do have time for questions. So if you are joining us live, you can post your questions on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube, and we'll ask them to our wonderful crew of broadcast thought here. So I'm going to start with a question, which is, you guys talked about sort of these real life Renfields, the enablers. How much of an issue is this in zombification more broadly of, having individuals who sort of facilitate the control of others? Is it hard as, one individual on your own without facilitators to maintain control over lots of individuals, or does it really vary? I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it varies. It's really dark to talk about, but if you think about it, there are facilitators in throughout many of these types of criminal behaviors. When you think of trafficking, when you think of grooming, all of the different victims, when you think of even some of the cults, much of what they can do would not happen if they didn't have the enablers or familiars, if you want to call them that.
Yeah, well, it is kind of depressing, but it's also, what makes me think about is the fact that sometimes people will be helping and they think that they're helping for a good reason. Right now, we're kind of coming back to what we were talking about earlier with cults, right? People will join cults and spend their time and energy helping because they think that they're somehow helping to save the world, when in reality, they may be helping to create and maintain a system that is controlling others.
Yeah, and I think once people have the realization that what they're doing is dangerous or absolutely not good, I think there is still that pull we talked about. There's a fear of leaving the cult or leaving that group. There's this idea that's been built up, this feeling of being important to somebody else. So it's a very difficult thing for people to leave and to really see exactly what they are clearly doing.
I think the scary thing here is everyone thinks that these bad characters here are all psychopaths, but the reality is that the human brain is so prone to biases and blinders and processes such as convincing yourself that what you're doing is right, dehumanizing your victims. And that's really the scary part here, is that we may not realize, with a clear conscience, we may think that we're doing something that's good, and it's not.
Yeah, we have a comment question here from one of our correspondents, David Buss. Buss says that Bundy quickly killed his victims and had their dead bodies under his control. And how does this differ from a situation where the manipulator actually wants the victim alive but under control?
Well, that can happen for a variety of reasons. So you have to look at the motivation. So in some instances, the motivation may be that a belief that I'm drawing the power, and so that's why they're kept alive. It may be part of the whole ritual, like it may be a prolonged ritual of the process of the murder, and there's some sort of psychological or psychosexual gratification out of it. So it really depends on the case. You'd have to see what the motivation is there.
That makes sense. Go ahead, Dave.
So, sometimes these groups, now probably not Bundy and Dahmer, but it seems like sometimes these groups do provide legitimate benefits, right? For the people in them. Because you talked about earlier, people would join them for things like safety and friendship. And I'd assume that sometimes that actually is provided.
Yeah, I think there's a human drive to want to be connected to other people, and cults often offer that opportunity to be connected to people. People just don't see that the connection might be based on something that's not quite so good. So I do think that there is that I don't know, just that drive, and that's what will bring these people together and get them stuck where they are.
I think the lessons will be to be learned there is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So, you may get some of that security, but there's a price to be paid.
Yeah. We have a question here from Liz Grumbach. She's saying, thanks, first of all, for going back to the original gangster definition of zombies as enslaved and controlled humans. And she's asking, is this all about control fundamentally? Whether it's a sort of settler colonial control or cult control or any of these other examples of control that you talked about, does the whole notion of zombies have to do with having control over somebody else?
I think there are different ways to look at it. If you're looking at the OG definition, I think it does have a lot to do with control and a lot to do with it's a very loaded word, but enslavement and having people under control. I think if you look at more modern depictions, there is something about losing control. That's what we're describing is losing the control of your whole brain. And there's just that instinctual drive. So control is certainly involved in all the definitions of zombies. It's either losing it or somebody else gaining it. And it is almost like a colonialism in a way.
So when you showed sort of familiars, right? Like with vampires, and then you showed some real life examples. And it seems like in a lot of those cases, both fictional and real, it seems like there's this idea that, well, if you work as a familiar, you get to then become the vampire eventually, right? So you're being offered power over like the people who, it's almost like a zombification pyramid scheme.
Yeah, we have actually a comment from our mating correspondent again, David Buss, along these lines. He says that, often within cults, you'll have social hierarchies and males will use their status to gain sexual access to women. Are there sex differences in motivation to join cults or maybe even, start and maintain cults because of the fact that sexual access is involved?
Well, I don't know if there's a systematic study on that. I mean, there's certainly different, depending on the cult, there's different ways of recruiting individuals. So there are differences there. I think the thing to remember is that some of the cult leaders are very charismatic and they're very good at figuring out what potential recruits are looking for, and they exploit that. So it kind of is what Dr. Bender was saying. Was that there's a promise of something, and then, as Vasila said, there's no free lunch here.
And it's important to remember that I think that the promise is that you're going to be more like the cult leader. You're going to be closer to the cult leader, figuratively or literally. And that brings me back to a scene in the 1931 Dracula movie where Renfield explains that Dracula told him that, he could have all those millions of rats, for himself. And, that, of course, is calling back to language from the Bible in which Satan is tempting Jesus. So it's that notion of really unlimited power and being like the person who holds that power. That is attractive to the cult leader, the cult members, rather.
I have a question going back to one of your examples. The Dahmer's victims, how were they enticed? Just because it didn't seem like he really ran a cult, right?
So the case we presented with Konarek, Dahmer actually met the young adult, I guess, or he was a boy technically, and enticed him to come back to his apartment for some modeling in his underwear. and Dahmer promised to pay him. And when he came to the apartment, he sort of hung out with him and did some things there. And I believe there were some reports of him maybe getting some alcohol in. So that's really was under the promise of money.
Sure. Okay. Oh.
Yeah. Christina Baciu is asking a question along these lines in terms of defense strategies. So, when it comes to having your will taken over, whether it's by a cult or any other entity, are there some good defense strategies that we can all be aware of and employ if we need to?
Yeah, sir. Well, I'll see what my colleagues think, but I'll just say one thing is I think having a good social support network is good because and trusting that, really giving up and trusting your friends or family here, because if you start saying things that sound off and you start changing your things that your identity or going against your character, actions like that, and your friends and family say, hey, something's wrong here. Having some trust in that will help. So kind of having something that can bring you back to what your identity is and who you are is a good buffer.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think having a more well-defined sense of identity can protect against it, because certainly those who don't, are susceptible to manipulation and that sort of undue influence from a cult leader potentially.
So would that almost be like, I know Steve Schlozman earlier was saying that you need almost like a checklist of things to do. Would you want a checklist to sort of be like, all right, these are healthy friendships, and if they say, okay, now we're going to eat somebody, maybe you say, oh, wait a minute, I need to reassess my social group, like something like that?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of times cult leaders prey on people who don't have strong support networks. So if you are kind of a loner and there's nobody around, I think check in with somebody if you do know somebody who can kind of give you a view of what this person's like. If suddenly somebody's great, but he just likes to eat people, maybe run that by somebody. Have somebody you can talk to about it. So.
Yeah, Ellen Kugel is pointing out here that these recruits have something in common with changelings. People who you think they start acting very differently, and that this sudden change in behavior may be kind of at the core of what's going on.
Yeah, it's very similar to, unfortunately, what we see in abusive relationships where things seem okay, and then there's a sudden change, and it's kind of excused, but then it comes back again. So yes, there is a sudden change in behavior, and a lot of times people just don't realize that maybe that's more of the baseline behavior, not the abnormality in their behavior.
Yeah, so it seems like, if somebody who you love is getting zombified, there can be also just some hints that that's going on, right? And a drastic change in behavior, someone changing their belief system. Those can be warning signs that that you should be aware of, right? If somebody that you love starts exhibiting them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I know one other thing that I've heard from like human trafficking sort of stuff is this idea that if you're told you can never leave, which you guys sort of talked about with the Walking Dead cult, right? That is essentially a warning sign, even if you're sort of blackmailed to say, well, listen, now that you've done whatever you've already done, you can't go back home. So that seems like another thing.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the, really pernicious aspects of cults. Often, people will get involved not knowing that they're doing illegal activities, right? And then when they realize that, that almost creates this difficulty in facing that, and then also the potential for legal consequences if they do try to leave. And so, it's really amazing how we can be vulnerable to that, but many times people are really just lied to at those initial stages, right? So it seems like that raises some important legal issues, right? If people were sort of under undue influence when they were being recruited and they were being lied to about what their actions actually were. So how does that get dealt with kind of from the sort of legal and psychiatric perspective?
Well, we're not lawyers, so we probably can't comment on that. But one thing I would say regarding this is that I think that there is a process here that happens across the board, whether you see it in gangs, someone in an abusive relationship, in a cult, is somehow their hope or vision of a life outside of what they're in right now is taken away. So before, they had a vision of, I'm okay, I can live, I can do these things. And they become slowly indoctrinated into whatever that group or cult is. And then you can't leave. And it's not that you really can't leave, it's that I can't imagine life if I left. And that hope and that vision is completely taken away from you. Until that changes, people have difficulty getting out. So that's the one comment I would make. The other comment I would make from a legal perspective is most of the times the legal system has deference to this concept that some of these folks are victims and they go after the big fish, so to speak.
Pam Winfrey is pointing out that it seems like a sense of self often gets eroded by the cults, and people's identity, right, then gets built up differently.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
That was the example we were using from The Walking Dead. Yeah, where people end up saying, "I am Negan." There's that scene where Rick is looking for, in the TV show, Rick is looking for Negan himself, and every member he runs into is like, "I am Negan," and then eventually Eugene even says, "I am Negan." So yes, your sense of self is eroded. You're just becoming part of this group.
Thank you. And I think it's about time now for us to start wrapping up. Any last thoughts for us?
Don't eat brains.
Don't
Don't
eat
have yours
brains.
eaten. Don't have yours eaten.
Yeah, keep those brains secure. That's very good advice. Well, Praveen, Eric, Vasilis, Broadcast Thought, thank you so much for sharing your amazing brains with us. It is just been a pleasure to have you, and we are delighted to have you also join us again this year for ZAM. It was great having you last year, and thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, it was.
Thanks
it was
for having us.
really- Yeah,
Thanks very much.
it was enlightening and frightening.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Zombies are everywhere, including in the media, where they are often portrayed as slow-moving, physically disfigured entities to be feared and avoided. Our next guest is here to tell us more about how these portrayals of zombies in the media may reflect our unconscious biases against those with mental and physical disabilities. Ann Jackson, thank you so much for joining us on Undead Live. Oh my, Ann, are you okay?
A bit of an accident
Wait,
this morning. Yeah, but I think I'll be okay. I've got a good doctor.
Well,
so-
all right, Ann. Well, I'm a little bit concerned, but I'm also very excited to hear what you have to say about zombification and disability.
I just want to make sure, that's an accident? You haven't been eating people as part of a cult? Just because it looks a little like maybe.
I'm not one of the brain in the brain eating camp, so no, I haven't been eating zombies' brains or anything like that. But yeah, we should all be aware of zombies and how people look at us.
All right, thank you. Well, Anne, we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us about our unconscious biases and zombies.
So my name is Anne Jackson, and I'm a PhD candidate at York University, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And my thesis is all about From the Living Dead to the Walking Dead, how modern zombie culture reflects, challenges, and perpetuates implicit negative bias towards people with disabilities. And you can find out more, and I have a survey if you'd like to take part in my research on a website, zombie-research.com. I thought that was funny, the dash bit, zombie-research.com. So I'm not saying, I want to be very clear, I'm not saying that people with disabilities are zombies. My field of study is critical disability studies. I'm saying that they're representative of our fear of being disabled, homeless, depressed, especially now during the pandemic. Why has there been such a growth in the entertainment world of post-World War II modern zombies? Is it an unconscious bias towards people with disabilities? Fear is displayed by shows like The Walking Dead, or how we see, feel, and interact at times with those amongst us, classed as the other, disabled, the homeless, the mentally different. And I have noticed that the other doctors have not mentioned anything about disability. But I have always been horrified, yet fascinated by zombies. And watching The Walking Dead, I try to intellectualize how they are both fascinating, yet repellent. They have a restless moving, no social norms, well, not our social norms anyway. They're unstoppable, yet most of them are slow. They have a dragging walk, like the typical walk of cerebral palsy. They are unpleasant, unwashed, physically deformed, sexless, and raceless. So zombies are physically revolting and sometimes smelly, and I will do a comparison between the two, zombies and people with disabilities. You don't want to go near them or make noises to wake them. You don't want to catch what they have, as that may be to face or fate worse than death. And they're also a step in between life and death, sometimes recognizable, yet not who they were in life. You see quite often in The Walking Dead, people can recognize their former loved ones, but they're not really their former loved ones. It's just a shell of what they were. But when people are faced with people with disabilities or other perceived imperfections, we're forced to evaluate our own vulnerabilities. And this gets very uncomfortable. So why are zombies so prominent in our post-World War II media, TV, film, gaming, and books? It's not how powerful they are that makes zombies so frightening. It's really how dismal it would be to become one yourself. I've observed watching people avoid people with disabilities on the streets. And I include people with visible mental challenges, people in wheelchairs, basically avoiding people who are not magazine or sort of airbrush perfect. Our general tendency is to avoid the disabled and to avoid any physical contact or discourse, as if out of our fear that their disability might actually be contagious. We might catch what they have. So zombies are slow moving. A lot of people with disabilities are also. Zombies are disfigured, and I hope mine doesn't get any worse. And people with disabilities are often disfigured. Zombies are exploited for unpaid labor, especially the very early original zombies. And people with disabilities are often poor and underemployed. We don't want to be one, either category. People actively avoid becoming bitten or infected. And with a disability, people actively avoid going near people with disabilities, as if they may have disability cooties or be disability infectious. So is being an undead zombie a fate worse than death? A lot of people feel having a disability is a fate worse than death, which is not a view I hold, obviously. So in the early biblical days, the Old Testament, disability is attributed to God, who brings it as a punishment for sin or disobedience. But in the New Testament, Jesus is compassionate to disabilities and the marginalized in society. Now, it's maybe a little controversial, but Lazarus and Jesus both rose from the dead. So were they the very first zombies? But the modern zombie brings a post-World War II survivalist mentality. Horrors of Hiroshima show how our human capacity for violence has horrific consequences. Television and internet images, along with the constructed realities of film, shows that these atrocities, which once seen, cannot easily be removed from our minds. And George Romero, mentioned before, obviously made the first film, Night of the Living Dead, in 1968, without the mention of the word zombie. And the modern zombie phenomenon created a new word to describe something already dead, like a company no longer viable, but still operating. So the word zombie is used in our vocabulary for many, many things. And we have zombie overload. Oh my God, you can't go anywhere without zombies. Thank goodness, I like them. So according to Stanford researcher Angela Vidagar, our modern obsession with zombies is connected with the survivalist mentality that developed after World War II. The fascination with the end of war as we know it can be traced to the advent of nuclear warfare during World War II and the concentration camps. The concentration camps were filled with people starving to death, and the images are just awful. We got to see awful actual footage of these atrocities on television and on the internet, and Hiroshima as well, another bunch of very disturbing images. And these images, once seen, we cannot unsee them. So is it easier to dehumanize things that make us uncomfortable? For example, war refugees who try desperately to be seen as viable human beings, and we turn them into zombies rather than people. It's an easier way for us to cope with the terrible things in the world that we really, a lot of the time, can't help. Our fascination for zombies could be because their decaying bodies affirm our mortality. Modern zombie culture is different to the original voodoo zombie stories, mainly because it's a virus-based concept, most of them. This gives us the hope that there is a cure to be found, or at least zombies are man-made, so controllable in some way. So someone has spoken before about all the books and films, but the books have been written on avoidance strategies, such as the Zombie Survival Guide by Books, printed in 2003. And also the US military has a plan at the Pentagon for a zombie apocalypse. It's CONOP 8888, and it's unclassified. So the zombies start to take on a sort of survivalist viewpoint. We're germophobic. Think COVID. And can you catch a disability virus like you can catch COVID? Malnutrition and inadequate health care and poverty all cause disability and are highlighted in our current worldwide pandemic. So there is some validity in those statements. Do people believe they can catch a disability? I believe some people do feel they can. And people obviously acquire disabilities, and we will all have a disability at some point in our life. Most of us fear death and believe we are unique in our ability to know that our lives are not limitless. Animals may not have this concept. I don't know if they do or not. I'm not one that can speak to animals. So our medical professionals take the Hippocratic Oath, which the first gentleman was speaking about, which is life at any cost. So the first definition used to be a non-beating heart, but it was more recently changed to being a lack of brain function. So hence zombies now are killed by a blow to the head. So apocalyptic conspiracy theories actually make us feel comfortable because there must be somebody in charge somewhere. So a fear of poverty and safety is apparent, and the constant search for safe housing and shelter from not only the zombies and in these apocalyptic films, especially The Walking Dead, but more so other people fighting for survival, control, and power. So the shift goes from being afraid of zombies to finding actual human beings much more scary. Government interference is no longer there. There's no formal governments, no internet, no television, no phones. And people with disabilities, pregnancies, illness are the first to go in the zombie movies. Parallels, the first victims of the gas chambers by the Nazis were the disabled, referred to as useless eaters. Do we actually want to return to simpler times when money and the stock markets were not driving forces and we could take care of ourselves, talk with each other, grow food ourselves? Are we as a society scared for our future? Things are changing. Do we actually desire the apocalypse? There's a lot of preppers out there. I do research on this. The prepper communities are so interesting. But think of apocalypse from a different viewpoint in film and television. Learning to survive together would increase our chances for survival. Furiosa in Mad Max Fury Road, whose missing arm is replaced by a metal one, is a prime example of a disabled heroine who is not only marginalized, but who thrives as the movie's protagonist. And Nick Saratasso was born with Hanhart syndrome. You can find him on YouTube. A rare birth defect that left him with no arms, an undeveloped right arm, and a left arm with only one finger. finger, he dresses up. Hopefully, he will keep that finger. He dresses up like a zombie and very realistically pranks people on YouTube, including cast members of The Walking Dead. It's very funny. Accept all of us for who we are. We don't need to be fixed. I know the first doctor said we're always looking for a cure. In the disability field, maybe, but people should be loved for all their different ways of being, and we learn from those disabilities. And more importantly here, Hubert Humphrey was a US vice president from 1965 to 1969, said, the moral test of government is how the government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. How will our governments be judged? Think COVID. How is your government being judged? So in closing, disability can be seen by people who have little contact with disability as a fate worse than death. Being turned into a zombie is considered to be a fate worse than death. Coping with this fear of death and disability has given rise to a great deal of zombie media, including television shows, films, comics, pulp fiction stories, games, and books. Therefore, it may be considered valid that the zombie phenomenon can be linked to an unconscious bias towards people with disabilities. Thanks very much, everybody. And again, my research is initially the survey is on zombie-research.com. So I'd love you all to join in and fill in my survey.
Is the dash spelled out, or is it just a zombie and then a dash?
Zombie-research.
Okay.
Zombie research cost about $500,000, so I thought I'm not doing that on a student's salaries. But happy zombie-research was there, and I thought that was kind of fun anyway, more appropriate.
Thank you, Anne. We have some questions from the audience. This was a really enlightening talk, Anne. I first want to bring in a question from Liz Grumbach. She's asking, well, what happens when zombies or the infected don't fully recover? So, for example, with COVID, oftentimes people don't recover fully and they experience long-term effects, and we're not even really sure what those long-term effects are, how long they'll last, how what proportion of people have long-term effects. So is this a moment for us now where we can talk about how ableism drives society because of the current situation?
The first people who were most affected were the elderly initially with COVID, and they are often seen as they're not really in mainstream. We warehouse them in old people's homes and things like that. And I have my father actually died a couple of days ago, and I miss him terribly. But I was terribly, terribly close with my grandfather, and he lived with us when I was a child. And I value him so much. And I think it's a shame that we do that. We do that with people with disabilities as well. Not as much now, but the people who have mental issues as well, not only for their and our own safety, they get put away in this warehouse sort of places like old people's homes, things like that, wards. And it's so wrong because we can learn so much from disability. If you think about I'm an IT accessibility person by sort of trade. And so I used to do a lot of talks on accessible things that had been invented for people with disabilities and how they come into the mainstream, like think texting, automatic door openers, the actual curb cut. All these came about from solutions for people with disabilities. And we need to keep that in mind, that people with disabilities make us creative, make us aware of the marginalized. And that's where we learn about human behavior. I know Canada's just done a great study, not been peer reviewed yet, on homelessness. And they gave money to people who were homeless and how it changed their whole perspective. They got jobs, they got places to live, whereas we just push them away, go away, we don't want to see you.
So I have a question for you. Because I work with a theater company that's like an inclusive theater group with a bunch of people with a bunch of different disabilities, and includes people with physical disabilities, sort of cognitive challenges, and then also a lot of people with like emotional regulation issues. And I think this sort of ties into a lot of what we've been saying. Is I've noticed even the people who volunteer there, who are trying to, be very open and accommodating to everybody, it's really hard for people to deal with people who have sort of emotional regulation issues. And I think that raises a lot of questions of like, at what point, when we're thinking about zombies or we're thinking about people who sort of behave badly, right? How do we accommodate them? It's because that can be a lot harder than accommodating somebody in a wheelchair. Does that, you know what I mean? So how do you think we should...
Yeah, totally understand. Because I started off in the physical disability world, and now I'm moving more into the sort of mental health field. And it's very hard to... Empathy, I think, is always the word that comes out to me. Try and have some kind of empathy for the other person's point of view, not even just for sort of the sympathy sort of aspect of it all, but how do their mind work? How can we draw parallels with what we're seeing, and really put ourselves in their shoes, hard as it can be, because we could walk around we can wheel around in a wheelchair, but we know we can get out of a wheelchair. So it's a little different than people that cannot go away from their disability. But empathy is the big thing. It could happen to you.
Yeah, on that point, Ely has a really great comment here, noting that even those of us who are healthy, we're really only temporarily able-bodied, right? Because as we age, our bodies and minds change. So does accepting that fact, can that help make people more accepting of the range of human experience from, fully able to less able?
I hope so. That's what I really want to bring home in my research, that when we see, and there's, like I say, the zombie movies to me are very interesting, but I think it's great if we see more people with disabilities on the screen, and then it becomes much less strange to us. I mean, we went through it with race, and we go through it too, Elizabeth, a lot of gender issues. So if we start to see more positive portrayals of people who are different in film, television, games, that sort of thing, it becomes more normal. And I'm hoping this will happen with people with disabilities, be it mental or physical. The more you see it, the less strange it is to you. So the more accommodating, hopefully you will be to it, because we will all get a disability of some kind, be it mental or physical, be it permanent or temporary. COVID, especially at the moment, is bringing out a lot of mental illnesses and an increase in homelessness. It could be us.
Yeah, and Pam brings up a related issue here of sort of ageism, and that's kind of ties in with these issues of us almost being a little bit in denial about the fact that we will be young and healthy forever, but really if we accept that we are all going to age and we're all going to, more likely than not, have deteriorating health as we age, hopefully not too quickly, that really changes things. And, all of us should have a stake in making sure that those who are less abled and who are elderly have those rights.
I also think about people who are deaf too. I obviously do some teaching, and I always say to people, if you thought everybody learned sign language as a language, that would be great. And I also scuba dive. So when you're talking to people underwater, if you see the signers doing it, they have a full conversation underwater. And with COVID, people wearing masks, you can't understand a lot of time what people are saying. You're behind a barrier, and then you each have masks on. Sometimes communication can be hard. So I'm trying to do as many signs as I can that are sort of universally accepted to people to communicate. And I thought that was a wonderful thing for our COVID times. If we all learned sign language, we could communicate a lot more clearly.
That's a great point.
It would work with zombies too, by the way, since they seem to only be able to say brains, but then you could sort of get them to be like yes, and then you could have a whole conversation with them. Yes. So
and and we have a serious comment here from Katina Michael that I want to bring up. She says that when she was 8 years old, her sister was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and that people's approach was sort of to have pity and sympathy, but not really empathy and compassion. So how can we sort of shift from a, sort of othering approach with pity to that more inclusive approach with empathy and compassion?
Yeah, empathy is always the big word. You cannot always have an understanding of what they're going through, but having some empathy. Again, having people with a range of disabilities is sort of as normal, if you see what I mean. That we're all different in different ways, and you see all this stuff on television where everybody has to look a certain way and be a certain way, and none of these images are real people anyway. They're airbrushed. It's terribly destructive towards body types or any kind of things that are very different than what we're used to seeing in film and television and magazines and all media. So let's try and bring in all kinds of different people with all kinds of different mental issues and things like that. I mean, Stephen Hawking, you can't say that he wasn't a worthwhile person. And at the end, all he had was a little facial muscle that would communicate for him. He did amazing things. So please do not ever put down anybody with a disability. And we need to see more people with disabilities of all kinds in mainstream media, in the community, not shut away and seen as awful. I don't know if you've ever spoken to people with Down syndrome. They're like little happiness rays. Honestly, they're so happy. And we need to see all these kind of things, and we don't.
Yeah. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. We would love for you to stay on with us. We're going to bring on one of our correspondents now. But if you'd stay in the studio with us, we'll bring you back on so you and our correspondent can chat a little bit after he gives us some perspective. So thank you.
I'd be happy to. Thank you.
All right. Now we have our zombie biotech correspondent, Gaiman Bennett. Gaiman, welcome to Undead Live. Tell us, what do you think are the biggest challenges we're facing today, given what you have seen in terms of zombification?
Yeah, first, just let me say thanks for letting me be a part of this. I mean, it's not every Thursday morning you get to learn about the psychosexual motivations of cult leaders and also get to confront your own prejudices. So, as Dave said, enlightening and frightening. Just a couple of reflections, filtered a bit through the work that I do. I'm an anthropologist by training. Every anthropologist has a people that they study. My people live in Silicon Valley. And so a lot of the talk today has been about the zombie, of course, but I study the necromancers, the people that make the things that zombify us. It's been brought up around our devices and our attention economy. And so that is something of the kind of framework that I use to approach these things and thinking about the cultures that turn us into the kind of creatures we don't want to be, and also thinking about the kind of, if you will, the magic that's used by those cultures. So just to pick out a couple of things that have come up already today that I think are quite significant. Steve mentioned that he had 4 lessons, and one of them was that we need to remember that they are us. And that we need to heal rather than destroy. I think very often, at least in the work that I do, there are kind of 2 problems with confronting that. The first is that the technologies today that zombify us are so often celebrated as being a kind of unmitigated good that when they start to do damaging things in our lives, we don't anticipate it. And this creates a kind of rebound effect where there's good guys and bad guys. We've seen this in the conversations around big tech. And in fact, the story of the technologies themselves, of course, is much more complicated. And so our response to it should be much more complicated. The lesson that Silicon Valley is only starting to learn for itself is that every time you bring light into the world, you bring darkness with it. And the kind of powerful technologies that allow us to do the things that we're interested in and that entertain us and that maybe connect us are the same kinds of technologies that zombify us. And so the power to do the zombification is always a kind of double-sided sort of thing. And so as we begin to think about how we respond to any of that, we need to think about the kind of double-sidedness of it. A second thing that came up that I think was an important question that Athena asked of the broadcast thought folks, which is when we think about the extreme examples of zombification, do we really have the right to compare it to the sorts of things we're experiencing today, like with social media and phone addiction? And it seems to me that that these are good comparisons, and they're good comparisons because they remind us we're on a kind of spectrum of intensification. The one difference today that I think is quite important is that in the older narratives about making a zombie, things are hidden, they're nefarious, they're in secret, they involve deep manipulation and a kind of direct physiological intervention. Whereas part of the scariness of the zombification today, I think, is that it's hidden in plain sight, that these are about social vectors that not only make these technologies seductive, but make them necessary. And they very quickly shift from being tools that we use to being social environments that we depend on. And once we're into the environment and it's no longer a tool, I think that then we're caught. The last thing I wanted to bring up, just to reflect the sentiment I think that really shot through the things that Anne was saying to us, is that when we live lives that are marked by these kinds of rituals of exclusion, there's a long history in the West, as we say, and probably in other parts of the world as well. But there's a long history in the West around rituals of exclusion, that the people that we know really are like us, but we're afraid of them. Maybe they have a disease, a disability, a particular difference that we want to other. We want to other them in part because we see ourselves in them. And the call to give up our rituals of exclusion, our practices of othering, and to enter into a more entangled set of relationships that teach us very different kinds of things is not only the right call, but it seems to me one of the few ways in which we can save ourselves in these circumstances. The zombification that is in the part of the world I study, the attention economy and the people who make it, is so often a talk that you can't change it, that it's an inevitability, and so you might as well keep pursuing these technologies. But that sounds a lot like the kind of language that the cult leader uses to say you will never be able to go home. And there's a kind of lack of political will and imagination when we think that the technologies that are zombifying us and the necromancers who are making that happen, that they can't be transformed and engaged differently. And it just seems to me that Anne pointing us back to empathy and a deeper set of engagements with difference may in fact be one of these places where we renew our hope that we can get outside these things someday.
Gaiman, thank you. I love that point that you made towards the end about how, we almost have this attitude that there's no other way than to be addicted to these devices, than to have them as a part of our intimate lives. And that notion that, there's no way to go back really does have this parallel with cults, right? And that you're in it too deep. There's no way to get out at this point. And, in a way, the phone, it does have your whole social world in it as well, often like cults do, right? Like that's how you reach your friends. That's how you have those social interactions. So Gaiman, what do you think are the risks of how deeply embedded we are becoming in our digital lives?
I say to my students that the only reason Karl Marx called religion the opiate of the masses is because he never met a smartphone. On one level, we know the risks, the immediate risks, because they're already with us. Some of the most important post-colonial scholars today remind us that when you're part of the privileged classes, you think that the apocalypse is somehow in front of you. But if you've ever been if you've been on the sort of victim side of the power of colonialism, you know that the apocalypse has been going all along. And so the question, as you ask on these shows, is how do you survive the apocalypse? I think that's an important lesson, to just remember that it's sort of already here. So we're already in the tangle of things, and we see what it does to us, the corrosion of our democracies, the amplifications of white supremacy. And, there is a long and very important list of things that we already see going on. And to remember that, sometimes that is the result of nefarious people doing nefarious things. Frankly, I think that when Facebook began to realize how addictive some of these things could be, and they began to capitalize the attention economy, it's very much like the cigarette companies learning about the addictive qualities of nicotine, and then rather than alerting everybody, they just engineer for addictive nicotine. But I think there's a lot of the apocalypse as a word that's already with us. Where I see things changing lying ahead that I think we need to be aware of is, this is the biotech side of things, that biotech is very much part of the data-centric economy, and it lives sort of with the same tools and regimes. And the kinds of degradations in our lives that we've seen resulting from the devices we hold in our hand, those are the same ways of thinking about our lives and our future that are going into the biotech industry, that are animating and driving the biotech industry. So I see a pretty serious threat of the kind of social impacts that we've experienced around technology actually being written into our flesh through biotechnology.
Yeah. So we have an important other perspective here, though. So Pam Winfrey, she is pointing out how her son has very important online friendships, and he says they're equally as important as his real friends. Gaiman, what are your thoughts about the potential value to having these online relationships, and how does that then sort of intersect with these other issues?
Yeah, that's such an important question. There's, I think, several layers to it. The first is, of course, the friendships are important. Our friendships are utterly vital to us, and particularly right now, at a time in which we can't have the same sorts of interactions with our friends that we might otherwise have, then the mediated relationships with our friends are just ultimately vital and keep us going. And so it's important to make a difference between the fact that these devices are a part of our lives and our tools for things like making relationships versus the way the tools work themselves. But I don't think that they're the same in lots of ways. One is just the physiology of friendship. From eye contact to touch to being together, the drawing close to each other and being in each other's presence. We're all exhausted by the life of Zoom. And part of the reason we're exhausted is because our brains are having to work overload on just a few sensory inputs. Whereas when we're with people in a room, like, we pick up energy and smell and sound and vibration and connection. And I think there's something about the embodied dimensions of friendship that are deeply vital. And so not only do these tools allow us to connect, which is important, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, but they steal from us our ability to build other kinds of relationships because they're so addictive and because they push us into directions that they want us to go.
Are we when we're talking about cults, there's this discussion of being past the point of no return where you can never leave. With technology, it's so all encompassing. Are we past the point of, all right, we can never leave? And
yeah, it's a real question. This stuff is so diffuse now. It's ubiquitous. It lives in all corners of our lives. And, there's a kind of geeky way you can celebrate the fact that everything now has a computer chip in it and therefore has a kind of protean relationship to us. We act, it sees us, it pushes back, we act differently. I'm sure from a kind of perspective of sweet technology, that's really quite incredible. But I think for the rest of us, there's something deeply unsettling about this. So the question of, like, can you ever go back? On one level, of course, you can't go back. Like, we've been changed by these things. They're in the world. But I think we have to give up on the idea that we have to refuse the idea that these are inevitabilities, because these are worlds that we built. And so part of the political hope and the moral hope is recognizing that turning our tools into psychic environments is what has set loose many of these forces in the world. And so the kinds of practices and habits that we need to develop are about reversing that in some way and returning to a relationship of tools rather than psychic environments.
Yeah, Gaiman, Liz is pointing out that things can change. So she says she just got a notification that YouTube is partially banning QAnon content. So what are your thoughts about, what's the hope here for taking technology and, creating the right kind of bounds on it so that it can be a tool for us rather than be a source of zombification?
Yeah, Liz is right to point out that things can be better rather than worse. And I would rather live in a world where YouTube bans QAnon content than one in which it doesn't. But the fact of the matter is YouTube's whole technological and economic model is based on creating the kind of psychic environment that gives you the problem of QAnon in the first place. And, so in the same way that I would rather live in a world in which the billionaires gave some of their money away than not. I would prefer a world in which we didn't have to deal with massive wealth inequality in the first place. So thinking about the calling out the ways in which these technologies are impacting us with their content needs to be coupled with calling out the ways in which these technologies impact us through the manipulative character of the platforms themselves. And unless and until the big tech companies are willing to roll back their business models that require a kind of manipulation, then, we have to draw a line in the sand and see things like banning QAnon content as preferable, but not really fixing the problem.
So I've got to be honest. I have a lot of concerns about the idea of YouTube banning QAnon content, not because I like QAnon content per se, but because the idea of it goes back to this idea of sort of social quarantining, that it's then these corporations making these decisions in terms of what is socially acceptable to discuss I find that scary. And I think it sort of ties into this question, I think, that we were talking about even when we were talking to Anne about this sort of idea of, well, what about people with emotional, regulation issues, how we will treat them differently. And we sort of approach moral issues differently,
Yeah. Dave, it's a super important point. And, how awful that we're in a time in life in which our lives are being governed by technologies. And so therefore we have to turn to the technology companies for better governance rather than, the civics of a democratic community in some way. I absolutely see your point that once you get a private corporation deciding what content we see, we're in a different world. But on one level, that's the excuse that they give, or that Mark Zuckerberg gives, about not regulating content. And the fact is, this is a platform that will drive you into the darkest corners, including the use of this kind of content. And so YouTube hasn't yet been willing to differentiate between their algorithms and the content that their algorithms amplify in the world. But unless and until they make that distinction, I think recognizing the kind of very deeply socially and personally damaging character of certain kinds of rabbit holes, and then closing up those rabbit holes, it's at least a conversation worth having.
Right. I could see that. I mean, I could see, I think one thing when we look at this technology often, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, this idea of corporations need to survive. And one really effective way, it seems, for corporations to survive is to play into the worst aspects of human behavior, right? And just give us things that will terrify us, whether they're true or not, give us things that are sort of immediately gratifying or immediately angering. And so I do think it raises some really interesting questions of how to balance that, and how much, it also, I actually, there's one question here that's a bit of a side note, but I think it sort of plays in a little, which is, are textbook publishers necromancers? Which for me, so I actually am a co-author on a textbook, and so this is one of these things where I know textbooks, there's a lot of things where it's like, all right, we want people to pay a lot of money for these textbooks, and I know this is a thing that students are like, oh man, I'm paying all this money for like going to college and then I got to pay for the textbook. And so I can sort of see like, well, yeah, you probably don't want to pay for textbooks, except my textbook. Definitely buy the textbook my name's on because I want that money. And I think this sort of buys into this idea of how do we as individuals who are sort of all in some way tied into this big cult, how do we make the world better?
Yeah, man, it's a good question. I don't think textbook publishers are necromancers. I think necromancers are the folks who are working the magic with these algorithms in order to stupefy us in ways that we, as your definition has it, we compromise our free will in some partial or deep and sustained way. But your last point is an important one, that once we recognize that this is all of us, then we stop with the good guy, bad guy games. And it doesn't mean we play false equivocation or false equivalence. The world is filled with malicious actors, and some people have more power than other people. So the kind of difference Zuckerberg could make around these questions is quite different than what we could do around these questions. But that being said, once you recognize that we're sort of all in this together, then the political stakes actually go up, and we recognize that that this is a kind of world we have to confront together, and figuring out how to resuscitate, as it were, the oldest version of democracy, which is just political friendship. Like, man, we live in this world together, and we're trying to make a world together. Like, that doesn't answer any of the questions about how we do it. But as I'd like to say to my students, I'd rather be dead on Earth than alive in Elysium. And man, we're hurtling toward Elysium.
So, Gaiman, what kind of solution do you think we ultimately need? Is it, a sort of top-down regulatory solution? Do you think that technology companies can change their business models and or regulate themselves? What do you think is the way forward?
Yeah, I think it starts with some kind of top-down regulatory solution, only because the actors have gotten so big and so powerful. On one level, this is an old story in industrialization. It's about centralization of power, centralization of the economy, centralization of technology. And so, like, step one is going to have to be the exercise of power of one significant actor in relationship to the other significant actors. But, breaking up big tech companies, for example, is a start, but it's certainly not the end, because the technologies stay the same. So breaking up the cigarette industry just distributes the cigarettes differently in a certain kind of way. And so there's a long game here, and there's a long game that's simultaneously about regulation. It's also about business models and innovation. So lots of people I talk to in the Valley, they see this stuff and they are asking themselves the question, what comes next? What is the business model that doesn't create zombies? How do I exit from being a necromancer? I used to be in the cult. I don't want to be in the cult anymore. And I think then also as it were, the grassroots side of all of this, like, we all are developing social habits that require us to use these platforms or we don't get to participate. And so rather than assuming that this is an individual problem, like I need to unplug my phone, we need to think together about how to create social habits where these dependencies aren't favored.
Thank you. I want to pull us back to this sort of YouTube question. We have an interesting point here from Diana. It looks like she's quoting a paper that is suggesting that radicalization on YouTube is actually stemming from the very same factors that persuade people to change their minds in real life. They're injecting new information, but they're doing it at scale. So what are the implications of this, Gaiman, this sort of, new scale of potential radicalization, persuasion, zombification for all of us today?
Yeah, the question of scale is so important and needs to be talked about more. I do some work with a colleague, Max Gabriel, around some of this stuff, and we talk about scale as being in some way the new demon of the contemporary world, and the imperative to scale. You talk to people in the tech industry, there's like this imperative to scale. But the fact is that the impact of these things on our lives really changes with scale, and it's different across different spaces. But scale is not innocent, and it's certainly not an unalloyed good. we are so used to the idea that efficiencies are how we deal with scarcity that scale then becomes such seemingly attractive proposition. But the negative impacts of things like YouTube or Facebook look completely different if you don't have scale, and it's scale of different sorts, across sectors, the depth in which it gets into our lives, the number of social habits that are mediated through these platforms. And so scale, I think, is an absolutely crucial variable in all of this.
Yeah. And once you have this scale, right, you also have this capacity to sort of create these new emergent phenomena if you have people gathering and interacting with each other who otherwise wouldn't have.
Yeah, this is exactly right. I mean, just apropos of the context right now, like there are monsters that come into the world through the aggregation of various sorts of factors, and they live separately from us. We use sociological language like systems or structures, and that gets us some way there. But there's something almost more organic, despite the fact we're talking about digital and technological things. There's something about the kind of emergence of beings in the world that take on a life of their own. Back to the question of like, how do you deal with any of this stuff? Part of it is like, how do you slay the beast? Because this thing has come into the world, and maybe you don't slay the beast. Maybe you learn to love the beast, but not by just letting it be who it is. There's some reciprocity in any of these situations of healing.
Yeah, I think one thing that we're going to be discussing throughout the next few days is this idea of sort of training zombies, right? Training diseases and promoting good behaviors. And I think often in our podcast, we've talked about corporate entities almost as their own actual entity, almost like these zombies that have their own need to survive. And so, like, I guess, what are some of the things that we can do if we're going to coexist hand in hand with these tech companies that are essentially, or these pieces of technology that have their own sort of need to survive, that's almost maybe even separate from the needs of the people who work for those companies, but they're tied in. How can we promote good behavior in those entities?
Yeah, boy, that's a good question. And the difference between a world in which we like keep the zombies but just train them to act in better ways versus a world in which we rid ourselves of maybe some of the zombies, but certainly rid ourselves of the forces that are creating zombification. I mean, those are two very different scenarios. On the first one, like, how do we train zombies? I think the step one is to recognize, like, it's not just individual humans who get zombified by the forces of the modern world, as it were, social groups and the companies themselves. I mean, when I talk to people who work in these companies and even run these companies, like, they feel zombified, like that they will point to whatever it is beyond them that they think is bigger and more powerful than they are. The markets, quarterly reports, the demand for AI to run even brick and mortar companies. So like, they've been zombified. The infrastructure on which all of this stuff in some ways has become zombified. And so, maybe our step one is like teaching better behavior. And we do that through regulation and, hopefully some degree of empathy, but then also like healing and, beginning to roll back this stuff is ultimately a kind of problem that we all have to face together, because there's not an inside and an outside. There's not the we in here getting zombified and those people out there who are doing the zombification.
Yeah, on that point of, sort of healing and how do we actually start to bring together all of our interests and our perspectives, let's bring Anne back into the conversation with us. Anne, thanks so much for sticking around with us. Wondering, what are your thoughts about what you've been hearing? I think you're muted, by the way, so unmute yourself.
Unmuted. It's actually great to hear people talking about people with differences, because it's so very important. When I started doing my research on zombies and disability, I was amazed there was so little information. People had drawn almost no parallels between the two of them, and the mental health issue more and more is coming up there. Technology too. I often see people walking around with their phones, and I laugh at them and call them zombies, because they've no idea what's going on around them. They just have their phone right in front of them.
Yeah, there's almost this sort of voluntary disability that many of us enter into, right? Like I've been on a walk where I pick up my phone and I'm looking through it, and then I almost trip on the sidewalk because I don't have my full senses. So, Gavin, it does seem like there's this interesting way in which we are almost willingly disabling ourselves in order to kind of get tapped in more directly to the sources of information we're getting from our devices.
Yeah, I'm a professor of religious studies, and one of the things I study is medieval madness. And we used to think about madness as lots of forms of madness, but one of the forms of madness was pursuing things in life that we think are good for us, but turn out actually to be quite dark and morally disabling, in the sense that we can't differentiate in important ways between the things that are good for us and the things that aren't good for us. To pick up on a point again that Anne has made about just the importance of difference and the salutary effects of difference. There's, a long history of the important place of discomfort in ethical growth, and that if we want to be transformed, we have to enter into spaces of discomfort and sit with them until we begin to recognize, the blockages and the prejudices that have created the discomfort. And now we are open ourselves to all sorts of possibilities we didn't have before. So Anne mentioned talking to kids with Down syndrome, like letting the rays of joy come into your life, and the transformative and healing effect of this kind of very material set of interactions is utterly important. And one of the things is deadening about these devices, and as it were an attention economy more broadly, is that the thing that they go after is like making things efficient, making them easy, making them comfortable. There's a deadening effect. I mean, YouTube optimizes for the number of hours your eyes are on the screen. That's what they optimize for. So now all this other stuff can happen because you're sucked in, but also all this other stuff can't happen because you're so deadened and you're so used to things being easy and comfortable.
Yeah, Alana is asking here, is it true that the titans of tech don't actually let their kids go near screens? Just making a parallel here with idea and pushers that you shouldn't do what you deal.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And it's the reference to the pushers is exactly the right reference. I work with Elizabeth Langland. Many of you know Elizabeth Langland. And she studies 19th century Victorian culture and compares it to the rising bourgeoisie in Britain, who started hiring wet nurses so they wouldn't have to nurse their own children. It's not as though these households with the tech titans don't have technology in them. It's just that the kids don't use them. You go and you hire some digital nanny to do the email and the social media for you. And so they not only recognize that it could impact their children, but they recognize that there's something at least potentially toxic enough about it that they want to create a human barrier that absorbs that toxicity for them, rather than to have their own children be susceptible to it.
I want to pull in one of our comments here from Indra. Noting here that some of our conversation sounds a little bit like we're kind of en masse externalizing all of our locus of control. Is there a worry here, Gaiman, that by having these kinds of conversations, we kind of take away our feelings that we should be doing something ourselves about this?
Yeah, it's a really important point. There's this way in which, as these conversations spiral about how powerful these technologies are, we sort of reify their power over us. And so part of resisting that is taking it back. It's, of course, a sort of old truism of sociology that all of us are shaped by the environments that we live in, and that our autonomy is probably always a little bit less than we think it is. All of our cultural symbols or whatever are mediated by things that came before us and will live after us. And yet at the same time, in the midst of all of that, we recognize that it doesn't zero out our autonomy. And so cultivating that autonomy and finding the ways in which we engage and embrace it is important on its own merits, but it's also important as part of this story, so that we don't talk about this, the influence of things like tech, as though we had no choice and as though we had to wait for Zuckerberg to act before we could be okay.
Yeah, I want to Oh,
and
Anne,
money,
please.
I'm sorry for butting in, but and money as well. I always find that such, such a thing. But when I started to do my PhD in a later life, people were saying, well, what's the financial, the ROI? And I'm like, because I'll be a better person. I'll be a more informed person. And I'm always amazed that people put money so much at the forefront over humanity. It's very disturbing.
Yeah, and can I follow up with you? Actually, something came up during your talk, sort of towards the end, and I think it's something that would be great for us to chat a little bit with Gaiman about, which is this question of, oftentimes there are technologies that can help to restore senses, to assist with walking. I mean, even just something as simple as a wheelchair, right? That's a technology that really it can be empowering for somebody who might otherwise not be as mobile. So, Anne, how do we embrace those parts of technology that are really helpful for people who have disabilities, while not sort of making it just that like they have to be whatever normal is, right? And having the technologies be about that.
Well, the wheelchair is a great one, because if you talk to anybody who has something, some kind of huge mobility problem, the wheelchair to them is, a gateway to heaven. It's just the most wonderful thing around. I know my father towards the end could no longer walk. He was 94 when he died. And I got him in what I always called an electric chair, but people thought that was kind of funny. But it opened up his whole life again for him, that he could now move around his flat. So they can be seen as hugely beneficial. People look at them and go, oh, poor person in a wheelchair. Well, I mean, look at it from the other way. Oh, great, we've got a wheelchair. It's just a different perspective, and you need to have empathy for people. I keep going back to the word, but I think it's terribly important. We miss it.
And I think there's also, just to add to what Anne said, the wheelchair example is a great example, that we shouldn't treat the category of technology as though all technologies are the same, because of course they're not. Like Athena, you know more about this than the rest of us, but we're a species that has long been technological. It's part of how we make our way in the world, and also part of how we make our relationships with each other. But the difference between something like a wheelchair and an algorithm that does micro-targeting is that the wheelchair is an attempt to create a relationship between an environment and a person that allows that to be a more navigable, richer, more fruitful kind of relationship. The wheelchair is the exemplification of the way in which we can manage our relationship to environments in order to improve our quality of life. Whereas these sorts of digital technologies are really changing us and forcing us to conform to their environment. It's like the idea that that some transhumanists propose that we should deal with things like disability through genetic engineering. This is the idea that this is the thing that's so disturbing about that proposition, is that why should we engineer individuals to fit an environment that they don't seem to belong to? Why don't we engineer the environment to get people to belong? And so the thing that I find the most difficult about these technologies and their impacts is that they're shaping us to fit the environments they want, not least for the money point that Anne raised. I mean, on some level, it's as simple as that. But thinking about how we use technologies so that we can have a different kind of relationship to our environment is a very different proposition.
Yeah. We have another question about tech. This one is from Liz Grumbach. She's asking, how can we make room for assistive technologies that, really are helpful, and also sort of resist those being colonized by just big tech? Is that something that you see as something on the horizon for us? Gaiman, looks like you're nodding.
Yeah, it's as per usual with Liz, she goes right to the heart of things. That's this sort of major question, is how do you get rid of the bad stuff and still keep some of the good stuff? I think it is a question whose answer is less about the kind of technologies that we have and more about the social conditions by way of which we live with those technologies and how those technologies live in our lives. So it begins with things like regulation and maybe breaking up the big tech companies. It includes things like social organization and social activism. There are really interesting groups that have taken up platforms like Twitter and use them differently, and as a result, create a different relationship to those technologies, but they do it together. And, frankly, a different relationship to entrepreneurialism. There was a time in life in which the prospect that you would have a startup was a risk. And, you were the kind of geek that wanted to try such a thing. It's not much of a risk these days because there's so many billions upon trillions of dollars in these sectors, because any of these big tech companies will buy up any good idea you have. And there are older ideas of entrepreneurialism that are about social change, but there needs to be space for that kind of entrepreneurialism. And we don't have that space right now, given that these tech companies take all the oxygen out of the air.
So,
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's all shareholders. What are we doing for our shareholders? What are we doing for the good of humanity? I mean, this is what we should have used technology for, not just how much money you can make out of it. I find that so obscene.
One thing I've noticed is with people I know who have disabilities, so they do use technology a lot these days, and which in some ways is really nice. Like people who have verbal communication issues can often text a lot. People who are blind have screen readers, but I've also seen these challenges with free to play games. I know somebody who has a son who's autistic who spent thousands of dollars on some sort of free to play thing on his mom's phone, and I think a lot of times people who have special needs can have really big challenges with these things. And I don't really know what the question is with that, but it's just sort of a thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it does bring up this issue that some people with disabilities may also be more vulnerable to certain aspects of technology and may need extra protections against these sort of zombification forces. And, that's something that I haven't really heard much discussion about that issue.
Yeah, Athena, my mind went to the same place. Is on the one hand, we don't want to lose track of the fact that people who, for example, are bound to their homes, lots of us are experiencing that now, but others experience that all the time. For them, these kinds of technological mediations are utterly important, but that degree of importance then also increases degree of vulnerability, because the importance creates dependency, and then the dependency gets exploited. And so, the fact that people with disabilities can really have enriched relationships with these technologies should be yet another reason why we try to get it right in terms of how these technologies impact us.
Yeah. And do you have any last words for us about this issue of, how can we both leverage the good of technology for helping people who have disabilities, but also not lose sight of the fact that, they don't need those technologies in order to be included and accepted?
It goes down to, I think it has to come down. It's like good parenting or bad parenting. It unfortunately has to come down an awful lot from governments and how the governments see it all. Because if there was more money put into using technologies for the good of everybody, then it would be more sort of socially acceptable. It's the same way as you're trying to get people with disabilities into film and television. If we see it more, if we're more aware, then and we're encouraged that this is a good thing, then technologies will be used for that. The emphasis at the moment is so terribly much on money. The stock exchange, all those kind of things. It's very counterproductive to the human race as people.
Yeah. Well, Anne, thank you so much. Gaiman, do you have any last words for us?
Well, I just maybe echo the sentiment that Anne ended with, which is that, let's not forget that the founding figures of capitalism as a political philosophy were theologians who believed that the world was a pretty screwed up place. And they wanted to make an argument that despite the violence of the world, some good could still come of it. And where that cashed out was the idea that we can't do good. So let's just pursue our selfishness and good will somehow magically come of it. Well, as though we needed another example, the tech industry displays yet again that the pursuit of money as the primary driver creates a world in which you pursue money as the primary driver. All it does is sort of double down on its own logic. And so, it's an old story and an old fight, but, thinking and acting deeply around this question of like, what do we actually want? And so instead of using the idea of the market or whatever as the like thing that's going to give us what we want, as though it were an after effect, like today we can go after that stuff. We don't have to wait for the tech industry to change.
Thank you, Gaiman. And thank you, Anne. Thank you all for sharing your brains with us and joining us for the morning edition of Undead Live. Tune in to Eat, Pray, Run coming up next here on Channel Z. And remember, the best way to protect your brains in the zombie apocalypse is to share them.
But then they might get eaten.
You got to share your brains.
Unless you share them with people in a cult. So,
I know it's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.